Belief is the enemy of knowing.
All right, man. Welcome to Crow 777 Radio. This is episode 613. It is me and Jason, and we are going to discuss the military-industrial complex. So welcome, Jason.
And a very fine afternoon it is.
So I just did an episode on Sam Tripoli's tinfoil hat. It was actually quite popular. We've gotten a lot of contacts since I did that. And actually, a lot of people have been grabbing the solar imagery since I did that. We talked all about the second sun, but this time I brought some receipts with me. So not as easy to dismiss.
Always a good thing. Glad to know that it's going over well.
Yeah, going over very well. Anyhow, it's unless you don't have anything, let's do this.
So today we're going to talk about the military-industrial complex. The definition of that is the network of individuals and institutions involved in the production of weapons and military technologies. The military-industrial complex in a country typically attempts to marshal political support for continued or increased military spending by the national government. The term military-industrial complex was first used in a very widespread public way by U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower in his farewell address on January 17, 1961. As we will see, the notion of the military-industrial complex functioning in some capacity goes back much further than the 1960s.
You know, you can still look up old Dwight, the clip on YouTube of him warning that there's a big problem, and that problem is the military-industrial complex. But you got to wonder, Jason, is this more just announcing this is what's happening? Is it a bit like revelation of method, or is it something else? And the more I think about it, the more I think it's not him being a good guy. Maybe he was, but my point is this. Coming off World War II, my grandparents and my parents were as proud as anyone could be of their country. They were told they just saved the world. They were the great white knight. People had died. World War II was a big deal, but what's more is my grandparents could remember World War I, which very few of us remember now. As a matter of fact, in all the things that I study and read, really the only meaningful references to World War I that I see anymore are in the Steiner books, where he was saying things, but the people that did the prologues in his books are basically saying, we can't even describe what a world change and a big deal World War I was. And when you combine that with what happened during World War II, and here's the president warning us all, to me, it's like hollering into an empty bucket. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it.
Well, as far as World War I don't think there's hardly anybody left at this point who would know the changes that came about as a result of that. As far as World War II is concerned, we're getting pretty low on them as well. And the 50s that came after World War II were what most people consider the prime time of America, if you want to put it that way. And what Dwight D. Eisenhower said, whether he was doing it with ulterior motives or not, definitely foreshadowed the things that were coming in the following decades.
What's crazy is most people, like if you pulled people over today and said, what started World War I? When did it happen? Very few people would have any idea of it. But when you think about this, there's only scant decades in between the First World War and the Second World War. And you've got to realize that the world was not as modern militaristic as it is as a result of those things. And it's never let off. Someone hit the gas pedal after World War II, which was part of what Dwight was talking about. But it is a very different world than the world my grandparents could remember by dint of having been alive at the end of the 1800s.
And that's exactly what we're going to get into here as we move through the timeline. The cooperation of industry and the production of weapons for the government has gone on for a very long time. In 1775, during the American Revolutionary War, The first signs of an industrial-military relationship can be traced to when the Continental Congress authorized the construction of naval vessels and the purchase of arms. This would be the beginning of the U.S. government's reliance on the private sector for military supplies. At this time, the American colonies lacked any sort of industrial base that could fully support a prolonged war effort. There were no large-scale gun manufacturers that were capable of supplying the needed quantities of arms, which led to reliance on both domestic and foreign sources for the needed military equipment. Local blacksmiths, gunsmiths, and small manufacturers produced some of the needed arms, but the output was completely insufficient for the scale of the conflict. The Continental Congress encouraged the conversion of civilian industries to military production wherever this was possible. As an example, they supported the conversion of merchant ships into warships. Significant military aid came from France, the Dutch Republic, and Spain. France in particular became quite a crucial ally, secretly supplying arms and supplies before formally entering the war in 1778. The French government, through various intermediaries, provided cannons, gunpowder, muskets, and uniforms. The ships that would be carrying these very needed supplies often faced British interception attempts, but some managed to reach American shores.
So let's put a little logic in place to show the sweeping magnitude of what you just read. So in the beginning, we don't really have a way to get the weapons and everything we need. So consider this. In a normal world, not having the equipment and tools you would need would normally limit how big that endeavor could be. But this went backwards. They took private sector, so just private businesses, and they said, hey, we need weapons. So what does that actually mean? Consider what that means. You got a blacksmith or any other facet of private industry that retools to start making swords or guns or ammunition, any given thing. So what happens after this corporation, this private entity, has retooled and got these massive contracts, probably making more money than they've ever made, and then the war ends? Do you see the conflict that is happening here? And when they're saying in the sentence in the paragraph Jason just read that the supply was completely insufficient in a normal world, that means that whatever you're doing is going to be reduced in scope, when in fact the opposite happened. They tooled up the private sector and they got the scope enlarged. So I'm just pointing out that by the very act of going this way, you are creating a monster.
In terms of what led to what we see today, however, we can look back to the first half of the 19th century. Certain weapons innovations became available, such as the rifled musket, which increased the range and the accuracy of firearms, as well as the percussion cap, which improved reliability over the older style flintlocks. These technological updates necessitated changes in the approach of military tactics and logistics on the battlefield. This in turn required industrial support. Along with weapons upgrades, the development and continual expansion of railway systems greatly enhanced military logistics. Railways allowed for the rapid movement of both troops and supplies, both of which are crucial during conflicts. The adoption and continued expansion of the use of factories also made the production of military items at scale a possibility.
It's crazy to consider, but most of us can remember or have had family members that can remember World War II still. But the best decade that I'm aware of in American life is going to be the 50s. And why? Because of World War II. All these changes and upgrades and all of these things are put into place because of the war machine. And it would be very interesting to see how much of modern America and the things we use and the infrastructure we have can be attributed to war.
The American Civil War, which ran from 1861 until 1865, saw the significant use of industrial mobilization for wartime, especially on the side of the Union. Factory production for weapons, supplies, and uniforms were ramped up to accommodate the new demand. As an example, the Springfield Armory and Harper's Ferry Armory were key sites for rifle production, demonstrating an early government-industry partnership in arms manufacturing. Because of the use of factories such as these, The Union vastly outpaced the Confederacy in terms of firearm production by a ratio of 32 to 1. The Union was also able to make extensive use of the railroad system, enabling them to move troops and supplies in a superior fashion to the Confederacy. The North's greater industrial capacity also played a crucial role in the Union's victory. Government contracts to private companies for war materials set a precedent for future military-industrial relationships. Companies like Colt, Remington, and Winchester expanded or were established to meet wartime demand, illustrating how industry could, and most certainly did, profit from and were shaped by military needs. The war stimulated the economy, which led to increased production capabilities, which in turn supported a larger military effort. This was one of the first times in U.S. history where economic output was so directly tied to war outcomes, but it wouldn't be the last. The Civil War laid early groundwork, demonstrating how warfare could drive industrial growth, how industry could respond to military demands, and how this relationship would influence economic and social structures.
It's crazy to even try to get to the bottom of what the Civil War was about, but if you go back to the KL episodes, you get a pretty good picture of why things happened the way they did. It's more than just there were slaves and we're going to fight about this, more by a long shot. A big part of this was about the freedoms that people once upon a time had and banking or money in general. But to consider the opening statements that you made here, you're basically saying that the North was kicking butt with 32 to 1 production on weapons. So how is it even possible that the South could contend on any level? And to me, this shows the complicity of the bankers coming in to fund, to get things to happen. I mean, I got to ask you, Jason, based on the episodes we did with KL, do you have a vastly different point of view of the Civil War than you did from based what you learned about it in school?
I would say that I have a vastly different view, or at least a much more filled in view of the Civil War and money with the government in general. And just so everybody knows, there's a KL playlist you can go through where you will hear this information. It's very, very good stuff.
So when you go through the old KL playlists and stuff, you see how many moving parts and what's actually going on. To me, it marks like a significant point in the takeover of what America was meant to be, probably, and where we are now. This is a significant turning point. The other turning point, I guess I would put is what? Is it 1913, where we're starting to get the central banks and we get the Bureau of, what's it called when they're counting people?
That's the census you're referring to, but 1913 is when we got the Federal Reserve Act.
Right. So right around that time, we get the Federal Reserve kicking along, and then we get the Bureau, the census going. And these are the moving parts that put us in dire straits that we are dealing with now. But a big part of this war was about debt from the North and other things. Go listen to those playlists. But my point is, how can you start a war when one side is outproducing at an almost comical level, and yet the war still happens? And it goes to show you what the military-industrial complex can do. Not only can it choose a winner through the banking, it can arm people up to ensure that they're going to participate in the first place.
The Case School of Applied Science was founded in 1880 as one of the earliest institutions that was dedicated to technical education in the United States, focusing on engineering and applied sciences. It quickly became a hub for innovation in these fields. The name comes from its benefactor, Leonard Case Jr., who was a lawyer and philanthropist. He was instrumental in helping to found the secret society of the Scroll and Key at Yale University, which he attended and graduated from in 1842 with honors in mathematics and languages. Over time, the school evolved into the Case Institute of Technology in 1947, then merged with Western Reserve University in 1967 to form Case Western Reserve University, where it now exists as the Case School of Engineering. World War I saw an increase in applied science and engineering research in universities to support the war efforts, and the Case School of Applied Technology contributed significantly to this. The Great War set a precedent for academic institutions to engage with military needs, something that would continue to this day. During World War II, Case was one of the 131 colleges and universities that participated in the V-12 Navy College Training Program. This was a significant example of direct military academic collaboration, with the program offering students a path to a Navy commission, directly linking educational output to military needs. The Cold War era following World War II continued to expand this relationship, with the escalation of the arms race and space race, which caused a surge in funding for research in physics, engineering, and related sciences. Today, the Case School of Engineering at CWRU continues to engage in research with military implications, which includes work in advanced materials, biomedical engineering, and cybersecurity.
It's just insane to listen to you go through this, Jason. Basically, what we're saying is at this point, so long ago, the military industrial complex has put its Hydra arms, and there are way more than 8 of those Hydra arms, into the education, into the manufacturing, into the engineering. I mean, it's almost carte blanche. And to me, this is not normal. This is the kind of activity that separates a peaceful world or a peaceful society to a warmongering world. That's my point of view.
In 1897, chemist Herbert Henry Dow, who invented a new method of extracting the bromine that was trapped underground in brine at Midland, Michigan, established the Dow Chemical Company. The company originally sold only bleach and potassium bromide, achieving a bleach output of 72 tons a day in 1902. During World War I, Dow supplied many war materials that the United States had previously been importing from Germany. Dow was now producing magnesium for incendiary flares, monochlorobenzene and phenol for explosives, and bromine for medicines and tear gas. By 1918, 90% of Dow's production was geared towards the war effort. At this time, Dow created the diamond logo that is still in use by the company today. After the Great War was over, Dow continued research in magnesium, developing Dow Metal, a magnesium alloy that was similar in strength and performance to aluminum, but was lighter, which refined automobile pistons to produce more speed and better fuel efficiency. The Dow Metal pistons were used heavily in racing vehicles, and the 1921 winner of the Indianapolis 500 used the Dow Metal pistons in his vehicle. In the 1930s, Dow began producing plastic resins, which grew enormously to become one of the corporation's major businesses. Its first plastic products were ethyl cellulose, first made in 1935, and polystyrene, first made in 1937. In World War II, Dow contributed to the production of numerous chemicals, including those that were used in the production of explosives and rubber. From 1951 to 1975, Dow managed the Rocky Flats plant near the city of Denver, Colorado. Rocky Flats was a nuclear weapons production facility that produced plutonium triggers for hydrogen bombs. During the Vietnam conflict, they became controversial with their government contracts for the production of napalm and Agent Orange.
And this is case in point. This is how you leave a sane, peaceful society behind. So if we go back through the timeline, way back in the very early 1900s, first couple of years, they're doing bromide and bleach. Here comes World War I, which is no different than any other war we've seen in the modern era. This was planned and spurred forward and used to move chess pieces and control. So during World War I, Dow comes along to supply all these materials, incendiary flares, explosives, tear gas. Can you imagine the difference between selling bleach and bromide and all of a sudden selling these military products, how big your ledger sheet's going to get? So what happens when the war ends? Do you suppose these now major corporations that are probably among some of the most valued because they're making so much money off the war, do you think they're okay to sit back and say, well, we had a good run during the war? No, that's not what goes on. They start pushing for more war or more ways that they can, make their money. By the 1930s, they're enormous. They've gotten so big. And then all the way up to 1975, they're talking about their nuclear game. My point is it's a bit like they put the war train on the tracks in World War I, and it never stopped. And it just continued to grow and grow and grow. But what's the most disturbing is by the time you get to Vietnam, who in the hell uses napalm and Agent Orange against living beings? I'm not that kind of a being. I do not have that in my capacity to even consider burning someone with gasoline gelatin called napalm, or to poison them in the most heinous of ways with a thing called Agent Orange. But that's not the half of it. They're dropping this stuff into ecosystems. So all the trees and animals, I'm just saying the perversion is at a level that we are so used to, I don't even think we can consider it anymore. But the more I think about it, I almost feel like I'm a different species. I do not have it in me, nor if I was in the military, would I have it in me to follow an order to use these things against living beings. And that's how far off the tracks this military industrial complex is normalizing and pushing us.
How does the statement go? War is hell.
Yeah, exactly. But isn't it a shame when that hell gets normalized and then it's not even eventually recognized as a hell because it's so commonplace?
Getting back to the timeline, the lead up to the Great War saw an arms race among European powers, particularly Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, which was being fueled by industrial capabilities. Nations increased military spending and developed new weapons, which then contributed to pre-war tensions. Once conflict broke out, there was a massive shift to producing war materials. Governments and industries worked closely, retooling factories for war production. This included not just arms, but also infrastructure like railways and ports to support military logistics. World War I saw the first large-scale use of industrial technologies, such as aircraft for combat use, poison gas, and the tank, all of which required significant industrial support. To this end, the United States created the War Industries Board in 1917 to coordinate industrial output, demonstrating one of the earliest formal collaborations between government and industry for the purposes of war. In Europe, similar arrangements were made, with government contracts dictating production, often at the expense of civilian needs.
So let me ask a question. When you create, as the United States, a war industries board in 1917, is the mindset that we just got out of World War I and we never want to do that again? Thank God it's over, or is something else going on here? And here's where the perversion sets in. And by the way, I would urge people to go back and take a look at what supposedly started World War I. And let me tell you something, it's no damn different. And this sets aside the discussions that Jason and I have had about the reality of what it means to live in a world where central banks run everything. When war costs money and you're retooling private industry to make war weapons and other things, not only are you stopping most of the time whatever they were making, picnic tables or whatever it might have been, into weapons, you're making a situation where they're never going to want to go back to picnic tables because the money's not as good. You're going to put it in a situation where these massive corporations continually push for another conflict. But what's worse of all is logically you can work out that a central bank that's going to fund one side or the other has the power to determine whether the war happens in the first place and certainly who wins the war on the backside. So when you start hearing all these tales of World War II and everything else, the fact is it all required money. And Fortune, who knows more about this kind of thing than anyone I've ever talked to, regularly says that on the tail of World War II, the only country with industry left that mattered at any level was us. And that's what made the 1950s, and that's what made America so powerful, because everything else had been just decimated. But the point remains, if you control the monetary system in a world, you have the power to say, guess what? This war's not happening because we're not going to fund it. You also have the power to say, we're going to fund it, but we're going to fund this side a little better.
World War I and its accompanying war economy transformed national economies, with industries like chemicals, engineering, and steel experiencing significant booms due to the heavy military demands. After the war, however, this led to certain economic dislocations as industries had to pivot back to peacetime production. Regardless, many countries did not fully demobilize after the war and continued military expenditures to maintain readiness or to engage in smaller conflicts, which kept what existed of the military-industrial complex of the era active. The U.S. passed the Lever Act, officially known as the Food and Fuel Control Act, in 1917. This was part of U.S. response to mobilize and coordinate resources, such as food and fuel, during the war. This illustrates direct government intervention in industry and wouldn't be repealed until 1921. This act was a precursor to more extensive military-industrial ties that would occur in later conflicts. Post-war, there were public and political debates about war profiteering that led to investigations like the U.S. Senate's Nye Committee in 1934, which looked into the influence of arms manufacturers before World War I. Although not directly labeled as such, the military-industrial complex during World War I was criticized for creating a system where public funds supported private profits, leading to debates about the ethics of war and economic manipulation. World War I would lay the groundwork for the more extensive military-industrial complex that would emerge during World War II and continue on to the Cold War, where the relationship between defense spending, industry, and political influence became even more entrenched. World War I also highlighted the international aspects of the military-industrial complex, with arms manufacturers selling to multiple countries, sometimes to future enemies, before and during the war.
That's how bad it gets. You create this war machine, then the war ends. So now you've got the arms manufacturers opening a Walmart, right? Come one, come all, who walk or crawl, tickets, just 2 joints ahead. It's ridiculous. And this is no lie that they're selling sometimes to their future enemies. That's how bad it is. But consider this. So you come off World War I and everything's happened. What do you think the other countries in the world are thinking? We better get a lot tougher or we're going to get walked over. And by the way, when you get a big country like Russia, that becomes a branding boon for the warmongers, because then it becomes, oh, those Russians are going to blow us out of the water. And we're going to have to be in a constant race to make sure that our bombs are bigger and our jets are faster. And this little nugget of branding went on for the majority of my lifetime. And by the way, even though it took a little break, supposedly at the fall of Russia, it's right back where it ever was, right? Who's the big enemy? Well, now China is, but still, Russia.
The National Defense Act of 1920 was a pivotal piece of legislation in the United States, significantly restructuring the military following World War I. Once the war was over, the United States faced the challenge of transitioning from a wartime to a peacetime military, with the existing structure being seen as inadequate for modern defense needs, especially considering the technological and strategic lessons that had been learned from World War I. Therefore, there is a push for better military preparedness to prevent the kind of rapid expansion that had been necessary during World War I, but which was quite costly and disruptive to many infrastructures. The National Defense Act helped modernize and professionalize the U.S. military, adapting it to the new realities of what 20th century warfare would be, including the increased importance of significant air power. It established a framework for military preparedness that would help the U.S. avoid the scramble for manpower and resources that had been seen at the start of World War I. This was, of course, particularly useful by the time of World War II, just 2 decades later. During the lead-up to the Second World War, the Act's provisions were often underfunded or not fully implemented due to economic constraints brought on from the Great Depression. But the structures it set up were crucial when the U.S. ramped up for World War II.
Most people don't think about the timelines. So at the very beginning of the 1900s, we do World War I. Roughly a little more than 2 decades later, we're already in the second, wait for it, world war. This is not just a conflict or your run-of-the-mill war. This is another back-to-back world war. But wait a minute. In between World War I and World War II, we have the Great Depression. The puppet masters are not playing. And there are so many side effects we could talk about. As an example, how about, have you all seen the picture of the woman with the red bandana on her hand and she's making a muscle with her arm, called her Rosie the Riveter? Big branding mechanism for World War II. All of a sudden, we have become so warlike that we are pulling the women out of the household, taking care of the family, which was the tradition mostly, and we've pulled her into the war machine, and we get Rosie the Riveter. I mean, the overall look and feel of what America is, I really don't think you can separate it from the military-industrial complex.
There was a push for disarmament after World War I concluded, evidenced by treaties like the Washington Naval Treaty, signed on February 6, 1922, which aimed to limit naval armaments. However, the commitment to disarmament was uneven among the world nations who participated, and many countries continued military development either covertly or through loopholes. The Great Depression would strike in 1929, which severely impacted economies worldwide. This led to reduced military spending in some nations, but also to increased militarization in others as a means to economic recovery and national pride. This was especially notable in Germany, Italy, and Japan. Britain, France, and Germany would maintain or develop their military industries at this time. Despite the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles that the previous German government had signed, there was covert rearmament and military-industrial-like activity preparing for the war that the Nazi government knew would be coming. Despite the economic repercussions of the Great Depression, the period between World War I and World War II still saw significant advancements in military technologies. The US, Britain, and Germany all developed new doctrines and technologies for air warfare, which included strategic bombing theory and the evolution of fighter and bomber aircraft. This period also saw the naval strategies pushing to the use of aircraft carriers as the new naval power for multiple nations. Tanks also evolved from the slow and lumbering machines of World War I to more mobile and flexible military units, which led to the development of mechanized warfare concepts. One huge consequence of this was Nazi Germany's Blitzkrieg tactic, used to great effect with their takeover of many of their surrounding nations.
Think about what it means to a puppet master that people like to call the elite or whatever you want to call them. And then think about what just happened in California. Do you recognize that if somebody wanted to do away with massive amounts of evidence, that what just happened in California could achieve that? Now come back to the war machine. What do the puppet masters hate more than anything? As a matter of fact, the government that we just got here, what do they hate more than anything, particularly the right? Regulation. That is the enemy. Don't tell us what to do. Don't limit us. Well, when you're in wartime, there are no damn rules. They act like there's rules, but they can basically move pieces around the chessboard. They can take out evidence. They can take out infrastructure. They can run rampant without those get in your face, piss me off rules that things are usually subject to. So you can kind of see how war has become a world takeover tool by the so-called elites. They never want a time when the war machine isn't ready to go, and they never want a time when the next war isn't already being planned. For these very reasons, I would estimate.
As far as the 20th century goes, there pretty much wasn't. It went from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next.
So basically, if you consider all of the 20th century or the 1900s to where we are now, from the time this isn't quite spot on, but it is almost like from the time we went into World War I, there has been a constant, how can I say, maybe a constant strategy for conflict, for warlike activities. And sometime, and I wish I actually would have looked this up, Jason, you may know better than I do, sometime after World War II, there gets to be a point where there is never a time in the world where a conflict of some kind isn't going on. Are you aware of that time at all, Jason?
There technically are, but they don't last very long. It's only a few years between, and we're going to get to this in the timeline.
Okay.
We're going from World War II to Korea to Vietnam, then the continuation of the Cold War all the way up to the end of the Cold War with the fall of the Soviet Union, and everything in between there. There's also the space race and the nuclear arms race. So all these things were going on to keep feeding the beast.
Well, what's odd is, so I'm born in 1963. And by the time I go into the Marine Corps at the end of the 80s and into the early 90s, which is when I did my stint, which happens to coincide with the first Gulf War, when the first Gulf War broke out and I was in Japan, I remember thinking, I lived my whole life thinking wars were like a thing of the past. And part of that is naivete, of course. But the point is, when it happened, it was so easy to ramp up all those young men into a war fervor because they'd been serving in the military and they felt as if they had missed all the action. And that's the kind of programming that is endemic in our society. It's in our movies. It's in everything. It's in TV. You know, Jason, we've covered Hollywood, and back in the day, maybe around the golden age of Hollywood, or the so-called golden age, you weren't allowed to show violence. You weren't allowed to show a gun pointed at a person if they got shot. You weren't allowed to show them at one point being shot. And as that evolves, pretty soon, and it was a big deal at the time, you can show the gun pointing at the person and shooting the person, and then a little while later, you can show them being shot. And on it goes to where we are now with John Wick, where you're watching basically 50 people a minute getting shot in the face at close range. And this is all by design. This is all social engineering. It is not normal for a world to be skewed in such a violent, warlike mindset. It just isn't.
The outbreak of World War II significantly expanded and solidified the military-industrial complex, not only in the United States, but other major world powers, which set the stage for its enduring influence in the post-war period. There is no doubt that by the time of World War II, a very real and highly influential full-blown military-industrial complex existed, most especially, but not limited to, the United States. The War Production Board was an agency of the United States government, brought into being in January of 1942, that supervised war production during World War II. The WPB directed conversion of companies that were engaged in activities that were relevant to war from their peacetime work to war needs. It allocated scarce materials, established priorities in the distribution of materials and services, and prohibited non-essential production. It would ration such commodities as gasoline, heating oil, metals, paper, plastics, and rubber. It was dissolved shortly after the defeat of Japan in 1945, being replaced by the Civilian Production Administration in late 1945. The conversion of factories from civilian to military production would lead to almost full employment of the population of the United States and, although it's a complicated situation with many facets, ended the Great Depression. From 1942 through 1945, the WPB supervised the production of $183 billion worth of weapons and supplies, which is equivalent to approximately $2.46 trillion in today's money. This was approximately 40% of the world output of munitions. The UK, the USSR, and other allies produced an additional 30%, while the Axis powers produced only 30%. 1/4 of the United States output was for warplanes, while another 1/4 was for warships. The civilian standard of living was said to have been about level. At this time, the U.S. had transformed its industrial capacity for war with domestic manufacturers like Boeing, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, Lockheed, and North American Aviation, producing aircraft, tanks, and other military vehicles. By 1944, the U.S. was producing an aircraft carrier every month, 50 ships a day, and a warplane every 5 minutes, showcasing unparalleled industrial output.
Welcome to the bizarro world, and all of it normalized through movies, TV, patriotism, anything else you want to stamp on it. But consider a few things here. After all this had happened, do you figure a company like Boeing, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, Lockheed, all the ones that have been mentioned, do you suppose they got to play by the rules? Or do you suppose they get a pass when you compare them to other corporations that are not directly tied to the industrial complex for making war? But what's even more, they're now limiting things that we need to live as civilians. They're going to ration gasoline, heating oil, metals, papers, plastic, rubber, and we're going to be okay with it. When in fact, what's going on is instead of living like normal human beings, all this is going to go to the war machine. And it's insanity when you look at it. It is truly insanity. And to even speak in the way that I'm speaking now, well, for one thing, had I not served in the military, I probably wouldn't be allowed to speak this way. But the mindset is changing now. The consciousness is going up. And if I was to ask questions like, consider yourself in a situation where you're in the military and you're going to be told you're going to kill people. Now, this happened. I was in a unit when the Gulf War broke out, and this conversation happened more than once. And the majority of the young men in and around 20 years old, give or take a year or two, were all in. Give me a machine gun. But there were a few that were, I don't know if I'm willing to take the life of another human being when I don't even have a beef with them. And I'm guessing that where we stand now in the kind of consciousness shift, the number of people who would question whether or not they're willing to take a life is probably significantly more. But my point is, there is almost no facet of American life as we look back through our entertainment, our television, all of it, that isn't constantly programming the idea that human beings are warlike and we need to defend ourselves and we have enemies. I mean, what do you think? Is that overstated, Jason?
Oh, I don't think so. And I think as far as these companies are concerned, as you mentioned in the beginning of your statement there, I'm going to go with the word flexible.
Huh. Well, let me ask you, do you suppose if you were drafted into the military and shown a big scary enemy to hate and you were told to kill them, would you do it? Would you think about it? Or would you say, I don't want to do that? Do you have any inkling of what your reaction might be at this point?
I think I would be considered an old school pacifist.
See, to me, it's gotten to the point where even that label doesn't fit, because in the Marine Corps back then, when there were a number of people that weren't too sure that they were going to go pull the trigger, they probably would have been accused of being pacifists. But we're kind of beyond that, at least the way that I think about it. But my problem had become, if I went to these countries, would I have a beef with any of these people? Or is it the people at the top creating the beef? And if that is the case, why should I risk my life or take the life of another human being based on a beef that I don't even have any part of? And when you begin to think about that, you're not allowed to think in those ways. Those are words that will get you in big trouble in the past decades in this country that I live in. You know, you honor your military. And when I got out of the Marine Corps, you know, people would thank me for my service and other things, and I would smile and I would say thank you, but I was not proud of what I saw happen. I was not proud of what we did to other countries. I was not proud of the people that I knew died. And you couldn't say it. If you said that, it was almost like you were anti-American. And that, to me, is on the tail of a lifetime of this programming that we are warlike, that it is honorable to be part of the war machine and everything that goes with it. And even as I say these words now, I can detect that there may be many who have a problem with what I just said.
World War II saw unprecedented government investment into research and development, which led to significant technological leaps. There were massive advancements in computing, jet propulsion, radar, and sonar. The government's need for so much scientific expertise led to the creation of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which coordinated wartime scientific research. This furthered the intertwining of academia with military objectives. The government not only funded, but also directly engaged with industry, often through cost-plus contracts that guaranteed profits for those companies lucky enough to score them, incentivizing production regardless of efficiency or cost overruns. To meet the constant production demands, the government built or expanded factories that were operated by private contractors. After the war, some contractors bought those factories at discounted rates, which consolidated the defense industry.
And we're back to, do the rules apply to these private corporations? How common is it for you to be aware of some military contract that was vastly underbid, that the costs had quadrupled or more, but that's okay, the bill still got paid? How many times have you heard the story about the $5,000 monkey wrench being produced? This is not normal. In the real world, someone bidding on a contract and acting in this way, that would not fly. But also disturbing among all this is the thing that I always say, that there is no lie in nature. And in this kind of war-based economy that we're talking about, there is no consideration. Right now, as we speak, over the last year on the East Coast, a bunch of whales, even in my immediate vicinity, have been washing up. And every time I hear about it, I wonder if it's military radar or sonar or what's doing it. But my point is, how can it be that on the west coast of the country, there's going to be an argument made that water can't be used here or whatever it might be because of this animal or fish or whatever it might be. And yet, when it comes to the military and the whales washing up, that same consideration is not made. The war idea gets a free pass in so many ways that I can't even begin to delineate them.
So that's going to bring us to the end of hour one. And as you can see, we're still in World War II, and there is a long way to go to see just how many arms this octopus really grows to have.
You know, in the recent biggest movies of our world, where the majority of social engineering goes on, the big scale social engineering, the Marvel movies were a prime source of that. And in it, what do you see? You see the military industrial complex, right? It's what you see. You can see it going on. Interestingly enough, I understand that they're starting to have a difficult time getting people into the military because the younger generations are not used to the world that we were used to, where you worked at a job, whether you liked it or not, and all the things that go with it. But the irony in all this is we've reached a level of tech where it's actually going to require fewer human beings. The wars that are about to come and the conflicts will probably not be soldiers wearing uniforms on a battlefield anymore. So even the idea of waging war is now about to transcend human beings on a battlefield wearing colors and flags and things like that. But what happens when you get to Generation Z or the generations behind us, where they're no longer interested in taking part in that? And I think we're about to witness that very thing. Have you heard about this, Jason? Military not being able to staff very well anymore?
Yep, it's a big problem, but that might be changing soon.
Funny enough, I went through the Marine Corps almost on the dime as it was changing from what they called the old Corps to the new Corps. Part of that was women were going to be in and maybe let into combat positions and all these things. But when I was in boot camp, they could still beat you up, but they couldn't do it openly. They could treat you pretty bad openly. But in the old Corps, they could pretty much kick your butt to make their point. By the time I got there, they were doing it behind closed doors with one drill instructor watching the door. But shortly after I went through, all the old salty Marines were complaining that we were creating the sissy Marine Corps and that they weren't tough anymore and that your weight didn't matter. You know, it used to be when I was in, If you were overweight, they called you a diet private, and they put these stripes on your shirt so that when you went through the mess hall, they knew they had to serve you less food, and you had to go through all this stuff to lose weight. And apparently, not long after I went through, all that began to go away. And the old rules of you're tough, we beat you up, you beat people up, and you got to be fit, that was all slacking away. And it's bringing us to where we are now, where probably drones and robots and tech are going to be the front lines of the face of war. But Jason, anything else you want to add before we wrap hour one?
Well, it didn't really take long for the military-industrial complex to get a hold, did it? Just a couple of decades to really become so entrenched that it wasn't going anywhere.
Yeah, it's almost like it was implemented in a way that would prevent it from going away. And with all that I've read now, because I had a very blinded view of World War I, but now that I've gone back and looked at it and seen what the people who did the Steiner prefaces and all that, it is my point of view that when World War I came to be, it was instigated and it was intended to go down this road. That's the way I feel about it now. You got anything else?
No, let's wrap an hour two. We're going to continue on with just how many things helped really feed into the military-industrial complex that absolutely never went away after World War II.
It's ironic that we live in a world where the majority of people value peace, and yet they support this endless war machine. Anyhow, that has been hour one of episode 613, covering the military-industrial complex with me and Jason. All episodes, the first hours, are free at crow777radio.com. That is CRROW777radio.com. Members know to log in for the full episodes, and members get access to everything. All the comments, all the threads, all the forums. They can create their own top-level discussions, and they get access to the 2-hour film that now has 10 awards called Shoot the Moon. This covers all my older telescope work on the moon, so-called UFOs, the lunar waves, and included near the end of it is the first discovery of the so-called second sun, which I maintain is about to be a big deal in our world. Also, membership gets exclusive access to my current solar work. It is possible that my friend that I do this with, who's highly technical, may actually be acquiring an observatory. So it's a big, big deal if this happens. Anyhow, I hope to see you all logged in as a member for hour two. Well, you have to be logged in as a member for hour two. And I want to wish each and every one of you a happy, healthy, and higher-minded new era full of peace and far from war. There it is, man. Cheers.
Belief is the enemy of knowing.